They claimed the medic couldn't survive until she carried 3 SEALs to safety. Sarah Martinez had always been smaller than everyone else in her military training class. At 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighing barely 120 pounds, she looked nothing like the tough soldiers around her. The other recruits would whisper behind her back, wondering how someone so small could possibly handle the physical demands of combat medicine. Even some of her instructors seemed doubtful when she first arrived at the Navy Medical Training Facility in San Diego. Her drill sergeant, a massive man named Peterson, made no secret of his concerns. During the first week of training, he pulled her aside after a particularly grueling obstacle course session. Sarah had finished dead last, her small frame struggling with the heavy equipment and demanding physical challenges. Peterson looked down at her with a mixture of concern and skepticism in his eyes. "Martinez, I've been doing this for 20 years, he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "I've seen a lot of good people wash out because they weren't built for this kind of work. This isn't about being tough or brave. Sometimes your body just can't handle what we're asking it to do." Sarah wiped the sweat from her forehead and looked up at him with determination burning in her dark eyes. She had grown up in a small town in Texas, the daughter of a mechanic and a school teacher. Money had always been tight, and joining the military was her chance to get an education and serve her country at the same time. She wasn't about to let anyone tell her she couldn't make it. "Sir, with respect, I didn't come here to quit," she replied firmly. "I know I'm not the biggest or the strongest, but I'm not going anywhere." Peterson shook his head slowly. He had heard similar words from dozens of recruits over the years, and most of them were gone within a month. Physical size mattered in combat situations, especially for medics who often had to carry wounded soldiers to safety under fire. He didn't want to see another promising young person get hurt because they couldn't handle the reality of the job. The other trainees weren't much more supportive. During mealtimes, Sarah would often sit alone, listening to conversations about weekend plans and family back home. She noticed how the conversations would stop when she approached, and how some of the men would exchange glances when she struggled with particularly heavy equipment during training exercises. One evening, while Sarah was studying medical procedures in the barracks library, she overheard 2 of her fellow trainees talking in the hallway outside. Their voices carried clearly through the thin walls, and she couldn't help but listen to their conversation about the upcoming field exercise. "I don't know why they're even bothering with Martinez," one of them said. "She's going to wash out. The first time she has to carry someone bigger than herself. It's not fair to put people at risk just to make some kind of point about equality." The other trainee agreed. "I heard Peterson talking to the other instructors. They're all worried about her. Nobody wants to be the one to tell her she can't hack it, but everyone knows it's coming. This isn't the job for someone her size." Sarah felt a knot form in her stomach as she listened to their words. Part of her wondered if they were right. Maybe she was being naive about what she could actually accomplish. The physical demands of the training were unlike anything she had ever experienced, and there were days when she went to bed exhausted and sore from head to toe. But another part of her, the part that had driven her to excel in school despite her family's financial struggles, refused to accept defeat. She thought about her younger brother back home, who looked up to her and talked proudly about his sister who was going to be a soldier. She thought about all the wounded soldiers who might need medical care, and how her desire to help people was stronger than her fear of failure. The next morning brought another challenging training session. The recruits were practicing battlefield medicine under simulated combat conditions, with instructors playing the role of wounded soldiers who needed to be treated and evacuated. Sarah watched as her larger classmates easily lifted and carried the instructors to the designated safe zone, their movements smooth and confident. When her turn came, Sarah was assigned to treat and evacuate Instructor Williams, a stocky man who weighed at least 200 pounds. She could feel everyone watching as she assessed his simulated injuries and began applying the appropriate medical procedures. Her hands were steady, and sure as she worked, her knowledge of emergency medicine clear and precise. The real test came when she had to move him to safety. Sarah took a deep breath, positioned herself correctly, and lifted Williams onto her shoulders in a fireman's carry. Her legs shook slightly under the weight, but she began moving steadily toward the safe zone. Each step was a struggle, but she focused on putting one foot in front of the other, ignoring the burning in her muscles and the doubt in the eyes watching her. Halfway to the safe zone, Sarah stumbled slightly, and she heard someone behind her mutter, "She's not going to make it." But she regained her balance and continued forward, her breathing heavy but her determination unwavering. When she finally reached the designated area and gently lowered Williams to the ground, there was a moment of surprised silence from the watching trainees. Williams stood up and brushed himself off, then looked at Sarah with something that might have been respect. "Good work, Martinez," he said simply, but his words carried weight. It was the first time any of the instructors had praised her performance in front of the other trainees. That night, Sarah lay in her bunk thinking about the day's events. She knew that one successful exercise didn't prove anything, and there would be many more challenges ahead. The doubters were still there, and their concerns weren't entirely unfounded. She was smaller and physically weaker than most of her fellow trainees, and that reality wasn't going to change. But she had also proven something to herself that day. When it mattered, when someone's life was potentially on the line, she had found the strength and determination to do what needed to be done. Maybe that was enough to build on. Maybe being the smallest person in the room didn't have to mean being the weakest. 6 months into her training, Sarah had slowly begun to earn some grudging respect from her fellow trainees. Her medical knowledge was exceptional, and she had an instinct for emergency care that impressed even the most skeptical instructors. But the whispers about her physical limitations hadn't completely disappeared. The real test would come during the final field exercise, a grueling 3-day simulation designed to push every trainee to their absolute limit. The exercise took place in the mountains of Nevada, where the terrain was rough and unforgiving. Teams of 4 trainees would be dropped into different locations and given a series of increasingly difficult scenarios to complete. They would face simulated combat situations, medical emergencies, and physical challenges that would test every skill they had learned over the past months of training. Sarah was assigned to Team Delta, along with 3 male trainees who had all expressed doubts about her capabilities at various points during training. Jackson was a former college football player from Alabama who stood 6 feet 3 inches tall and had muscles that seemed carved from stone. Rodriguez was a marathon runner from California who could carry heavy packs for miles without breaking a sweat. Thompson was a quiet, serious man from Michigan who had grown up hunting and camping, making him naturally suited to outdoor survival situations. As they prepared their equipment for the exercise, the tension in the group was obvious. Jackson kept checking and rechecking Sarah's gear, as if he didn't trust her to pack properly. Rodriguez made several comments about how they would need to stick together and help each other if anyone started to struggle. Thompson said nothing, but his skeptical glances spoke volumes about his expectations for the coming days. The first day of the exercise went relatively smoothly. The team successfully completed 2 medical scenarios and a basic navigation challenge. Sarah's performance was solid, and she kept up with the group's pace without any major difficulties. But everyone knew that the real challenges were still ahead. On the second day, the scenarios became much more demanding. The team was tasked with treating multiple casualties in a simulated battlefield environment, with instructors firing blank rounds and setting off smoke grenades to create chaos and confusion. Sarah found herself in her element, moving quickly between wounded soldiers and making rapid but accurate medical decisions under pressure. During one particularly intense scenario, Thompson was designated as a casualty with a severe leg injury that required immediate attention. Sarah dropped to her knees beside him and began her assessment, her hands moving with practiced efficiency. The simulated injury was complex, requiring her to control bleeding, stabilize the limb, and prepare Thompson for evacuation, all while explosions and gunfire created a cacophony around them. As Sarah worked, she became completely focused on her, patient, blocking out everything else happening around her. She applied pressure to the wound, started an IV line, and administered pain medication with smooth, confident movements. Her training had taken over, and the small, doubted trainee had transformed into a competent medical professional. When she finished treating Thompson's injury, she looked up to find Jackson staring at her with surprise and something that looked like admiration. "That was incredible," he said, his voice barely audible over the continuing sound effects. "I've never seen anyone work that fast under pressure." The scenario called for Thompson to be evacuated to a safe zone approximately half a mile away, through rough terrain. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, the test that would determine whether Sarah's small size would prove to be an insurmountable obstacle. Thompson was a solid 180 pounds of muscle and bone, and carrying him that distance would be challenging even for someone much larger than Sarah. Without hesitation, Sarah positioned herself to lift Thompson in a fireman's carry. She had practiced this movement hundreds of times during training, and she knew that proper technique was more important than raw strength. She bent her knees, engaged her core muscles, and lifted Thompson onto her shoulders with a smooth, efficient motion. The first few hundred yards were manageable. Sarah had found her rhythm and was making steady progress toward the evacuation point. But as the distance increased and the terrain became more difficult, she began to feel the strain. Her shoulders ached, her legs burned, and her breathing became labored. Sweat poured down her face, and she could feel her strength beginning to fade. Jackson and Rodriguez flanked her, ready to help if she faltered. But Sarah had made a silent promise to herself that she would complete this challenge on her own. Every step was a battle, and there were moments when she wasn't sure she could continue. Her vision blurred slightly from the exertion, and her legs felt like they might give out at any moment. "You've got this, Martinez," Rodriguez called out encouragingly. "Just keep moving, one step at a time." Sarah focused on his words and forced herself to continue. She thought about all the real soldiers who might someday depend on her in a similar situation. She thought about her family back home and her determination to prove that size didn't determine capability. Most importantly, she thought about Thompson, whose life would depend on her getting him to safety if this were a real emergency. Step by painful step, Sarah made her way toward the evacuation point. Her teammates called out encouragement, and even some of the observing instructors seemed impressed by her determination. When she finally reached the safe zone and gently lowered Thompson to the ground, there was a moment of complete silence. Then Thompson, who had been playing the role of an unconscious casualty, opened his eyes and looked up at her with genuine respect. "Thank you," he said simply. "I never doubted that you could do the medical stuff, but I wasn't sure about this part. I was wrong." Jackson and Rodriguez gathered around her, both looking at Sarah with new eyes. The skepticism that had characterized their interactions for months had been replaced by something approaching admiration. They had all witnessed something remarkable, a demonstration of determination and skill that transcended physical limitations. That evening, as the team prepared for their final day of exercises, the dynamic had completely changed. Sarah was no longer the weak link they needed to protect and accommodate. She had become a valued team member whose skills and determination had earned their respect through action, rather than words. The instructors monitoring the exercise had also taken notice. Peterson, the drill sergeant who had expressed concerns about Sarah's suitability for the program, made notes in his evaluation report that would become part of her permanent record. For the first time since she had arrived at training, Sarah felt like she truly belonged. 2 years after completing her training, Petty Officer 3rd Class Sarah Martinez found herself deployed to Afghanistan, assigned to Forward Operating Base Chapman in the volatile Coast Province. The base was home to a mix of Army, Navy, and Special Operations units all working together in one of the most dangerous regions of the country. Sarah had been specifically requested to support a SEAL team conducting high-risk operations in the area, an assignment that both thrilled and terrified her. The SEAL team she was assigned to was led by Chief Petty Officer Mike "Bear" Sullivan, a massive man with 15 years of combat experience and a reputation for bringing all his people home alive. When Sarah first reported to his unit, Bear looked her up and down with the same skeptical expression she had grown accustomed to during training. At 24 years old and still barely over 120 pounds, she looked more like a college student than a combat medic. "So you're our new doc," Bear said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. "I've heard good things about your medical skills, but I need to know you can handle yourself out there. These missions we run, there's no room for weakness. Every person on the team has to be able to carry their own weight and help carry others when necessary." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Chief, I understand your concerns. I've heard them before. All I can tell you is that when it matters, I'll be there for the team. My size doesn't define what I'm capable of." The other members of the team were equally skeptical. Petty Officer First Class Jake Diesel Thompson was a demolitions expert who stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and looked like he could bench press a small car. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Ghost Williams was a sniper whose quiet intensity and lightning-fast reflexes had saved countless lives during his 3 previous deployments. Petty Officer Second Class Alex Rocket Rodriguez was the team's communications specialist, a former gang member from Los Angeles who had found discipline and purpose in the military. The team's first few operations with Sarah were relatively routine patrols and reconnaissance missions. She performed her duties competently, treating minor injuries and illnesses, maintaining the team's medical supplies, and keeping up with the grueling pace of operations. But she could sense that the team was still holding back, not fully trusting her capabilities in a real crisis situation. That changed on a humid Tuesday morning in July, when the team was tasked with conducting a raid on a suspected Taliban weapons cache in a remote village about 20 miles from their base. Intelligence reports suggested that the location was heavily defended and that the team could expect significant resistance. The helicopter insertion went smoothly, and the team moved through the pre-dawn darkness toward their target with practiced efficiency. Sarah carried her medical pack along with her rifle and other equipment, staying in her designated position in the middle of the formation where she could quickly reach any team member who might be wounded. As they approached the target building, everything seemed normal. The village was quiet, with only a few dogs barking in the distance. Bear signaled for the team to take their positions around the building, preparing for a coordinated assault. Sarah found cover behind a low wall about 50 yards from the main entrance, her medical supplies ready and her rifle trained on potential threats. The assault began with a flashbang grenade that lit up the night sky and shattered the silence. The SEALs moved into the building with fluid precision, their training evident in every movement. Sarah listened to their radio communications, tracking their progress and preparing to provide medical support if needed. Everything went wrong in a matter of seconds. Hidden fighters in a nearby building opened fire on the assault team with automatic weapons, catching them in a deadly crossfire. The radio exploded with urgent calls for support and reports of casualties. Sarah could hear the panic in voices that she had never heard express fear before. "Doc, we need you now." Bear's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got multiple casualties. In the building. Diesel is down bad and Ghost took one in the leg. We're pinned down and can't move them." Sarah felt her training take over, pushing aside any fear or uncertainty. She assessed the situation quickly, noting the positions of the enemy fighters and the best route to reach her wounded teammates. The enemy fire was intense, with bullets striking the wall around her and kicking up dust and debris. Without hesitation, Sarah left her covered position and began moving toward the building where her team was trapped. She stayed low, using every bit of cover available while making her way across the dangerous open ground. Bullets whined overhead, and she could hear the distinctive crack of rifle rounds passing close by. As she reached the building entrance, Bear grabbed her arm and pulled her inside. "Thank God you made it," he said, his face grim with worry. "Diesel's in bad shape and we can't stay here much longer. They're bringing up reinforcements." Sarah quickly assessed the situation. Diesel was unconscious and bleeding heavily from shrapnel wounds to his chest and abdomen. Ghost was alert but in significant pain from a bullet wound to his upper thigh that had missed the major arteries but was bleeding steadily. Both men needed immediate medical attention and evacuation to survive. Working quickly and efficiently, Sarah began treating Diesel's wounds first. She started 2 IV lines, applied pressure bandages to control the bleeding, and administered pain medication and antibiotics. Her hands moved with practiced precision, even as enemy fire continued to pour into the building around them. "How bad? Is it, Doc?" Bear asked, his voice tight with concern for his wounded teammate. "He's stable for now, but he needs surgery soon," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "The shrapnel missed his heart and lungs, but there might be internal bleeding. We need to get him out of here." She quickly moved to treat Ghost's leg wound, cleaning and bandaging the injury while keeping one eye on Diesel's condition. The sound of gunfire was getting closer, and she could hear Bear coordinating with other units for support and extraction. "The chopper can't land here," Bear announced grimly. "Too much enemy fire. We need to move to the alternate landing zone, but that's half a mile through open ground. I don't know how we're going to move 2 casualties that distance under fire." Sarah looked up from her patients and met Bear's eyes with steady determination. "Chief, I can carry them. Both of them. I've done it in training and I can do it now. We're not leaving anyone behind." Bear stared at her for a moment, clearly torn between admiration for her courage and doubt about her physical capabilities. Diesel alone weighed nearly 200 pounds, and Ghost, despite his injury, was still a solid 180 pounds of muscle. The idea of someone Sarah's size carrying both men to safety seemed impossible. But as enemy fire intensified and time ran out, Bear realized they had no other choice. "All right, Doc," he said finally. "We'll cover you. But if you can't handle it, you tell me immediately. We'll figure out something else." Sarah nodded, her mind already working out the logistics of moving 2 wounded men across dangerous terrain while under enemy fire. It would be the greatest physical challenge of her life, but she was determined to save her teammates no matter what it took. The enemy fire was getting heavier by the minute, and Sarah knew they were running out of time. She quickly rechecked Diesel's bandages and IV lines, making sure everything was secure for transport. Ghost was conscious but weakening from blood loss, and both men needed immediate evacuation to have any chance of survival. "Ghost, can you hear me?" Sarah asked, kneeling beside the wounded sniper. "I need to know if you can hold on to me while I carry you. Can you wrap your arms around my neck?" Ghost nodded weakly, his face pale but determined. "I can do it, Doc. Just get us out of here." Sarah looked at the tactical situation developing around them. Bear and Rocket were maintaining defensive positions at the windows, returning fire against an increasing number of enemy fighters. The Taliban had obviously called for reinforcements, and the SEALs were becoming dangerously outnumbered. "Chief, I'm going to take Ghost first," Sarah called out over the sound of gunfire. "He's lighter and conscious, so it'll be easier to manage. I'll get him to the landing zone and come back for Diesel." Bear shook his head immediately. "Negative, Doc, we can't split up the team. If you leave with Ghost and we get overrun, Diesel dies. And if something happens to you on the way, we lose our medic and Ghost both. We need another solution." Sarah felt the weight of the impossible decision pressing down on her. Every option seemed to lead to someone being left behind or put at greater risk. The sound of helicopter rotors in the distance told her that their extraction was approaching, but the aircraft couldn't land until they reached the designated landing zone. Suddenly, an idea formed in her mind. It was crazy and probably impossible, but it might be their only chance to save everyone. She had never attempted anything like it, even in training, but desperate times called for desperate measures. "Chief, what if I carry them both at the same time?" she asked, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Ghost can hold onto my back while I carry Diesel in front. It's not standard procedure, but it might work." Bear stared at her in disbelief. The idea of someone Sarah's size attempting to carry nearly 400 pounds of wounded soldiers across half a mile of dangerous terrain seemed beyond impossible. But as another burst of enemy fire shattered the window beside him, he realized they were out of conventional options. "Are you sure you can do this, Doc?" he asked, his voice heavy with concern. "If you collapse halfway there, all 3 of you could die." Sarah took a deep breath and checked her equipment one more time. Her medical pack would have to stay behind to reduce weight, taking only the most essential supplies in her cargo pockets. Every ounce would matter for what she was about to attempt. "I've trained for this moment my whole career," she said with quiet confidence. "Those men trusted me with their lives when we came on this mission. I'm not going to let them down now." Bear nodded slowly, recognizing the determination in her voice that he had learned to respect over their months of working together. "All right, Doc. We'll provide covering fire and move with you as far as we can. But the final stretch to the landing zone, you'll be on your own." Sarah began preparing her patients for transport. She secured Ghost's leg wound with additional bandaging and gave him a shot of morphine to help manage the pain during movement. For Diesel, She double-checked all his bandages and made sure his IV lines were taped securely to prevent them from being pulled out during transport. "Ghost, I need you to climb onto my back and hold on as tight as you can," she instructed. "Keep your wounded leg straight and try not to put any weight on it. Can you do that?" Despite his pain and blood loss, Ghost managed a weak smile. "Doc, I've rappelled down cliffs and jumped out of helicopters. I think I can handle hanging onto someone half my size." With Bear's help, Ghost positioned himself on Sarah's back, wrapping his arms around her shoulders and gripping tightly with his hands. The additional weight was immediately noticeable, but Sarah adjusted her stance and prepared for the more difficult task of lifting Diesel. Diesel was unconscious and dead weight, making him much more difficult to manage than Ghost. Sarah positioned herself carefully, using proper lifting technique to get the wounded demolitions expert into a modified fireman's carry across her shoulders. The combined weight of both men was staggering, and for a moment she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. "Holy hell, Doc," Rocket whispered from his position by the window. "You actually got them both up. I can't believe what I'm seeing." Sarah tested her balance and took a few experimental steps around the room. The weight was almost overwhelming, and she could already feel the strain in her legs and back. But her teammates were depending on her, and failure wasn't an option. "I'm ready, Chief," she announced, her voice slightly strained from the effort of supporting both men. "Let's move out." Bear and Rocket laid down suppressing fire as Sarah made her way to the building's rear exit. Every step was a monumental effort, requiring her to focus completely on maintaining her balance while carrying nearly 3 times her own body weight. The enemy fire seemed to intensify as they moved, with bullets striking the walls around them and kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Once outside the building, Sarah began the most challenging journey of her life. The terrain was rough and uneven, with loose rocks and hidden holes that threatened to trip her with every step. The weight of her 2 teammates made each movement deliberate and careful, as a single misstep could result in disaster for all 3 of them. Behind her, Bear and Rocket continued to provide covering fire, but the enemy was pursuing them aggressively. Sarah could hear the sound of boots on gravel and angry voices shouting in Pashto as the Taliban fighters attempted to cut off their escape route. "Doc, you're doing great," Ghost whispered in her ear, his voice weak but encouraging. "Just keep moving forward. Don't look back. Don't think about how far we have to go. Just focus on the next step." Sarah fixed her eyes on the distant hilltop where the helicopter was supposed to land and forced herself to keep moving. Each step sent waves of pain through her legs and back, and she could feel sweat pouring down her face despite the cool morning air. Her breathing was labored and her heart felt like it might explode from the exertion. Halfway to the landing zone, Sarah began to realize the true magnitude of what she had attempted. Her legs were shaking from fatigue, and she could feel her strength beginning to fail. The weight that had seemed manageable for the first few hundred yards now felt impossible to bear for much longer. But giving up wasn't an option. 2 lives depended on her completing this seemingly impossible task, and she would rather collapse from exhaustion than abandon her teammates. She thought about all the people who had doubted her over the years, all the voices that had said she was too small and too weak for this job. Now was her chance to prove them all wrong. 3/4 of the way to the landing zone, Sarah's legs finally began to give out. The overwhelming weight of both wounded SEALs had pushed her beyond her physical limits, and she stumbled badly on loose rocks, nearly falling. Ghost's grip around her neck was the only thing that kept them all from crashing to the ground. "Doc, you need to put us down and rest," Ghost whispered urgently in her ear. "You're going to kill yourself trying to carry us both." Sarah shook her head stubbornly, even though every muscle in her body was screaming in protest. "I'm not stopping," she gasped between ragged breaths. "We're too close to quit now." Behind them, the sound of enemy fire was getting closer. Bear and Rocket were fighting a running battle, trying to keep the Taliban fighters at a distance while staying close enough to provide protection for Sarah and her precious cargo. The situation was deteriorating rapidly, and everyone knew that time was running out. "Movement on the ridge," Rocket called out over the radio. "We've got enemy fighters trying to cut off our route to the landing zone. They're going to be there before we are if we don't move faster." Sarah could see the enemy soldiers moving across the hillside, their AK-47s glinting in the morning sunlight as they rushed to intercept the American team. If they reached the landing zone first, the helicopter wouldn't be able to land and all of them would be trapped with nowhere to go. Drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed, Sarah forced herself to move faster. Each step was agony, and she could feel something in her back beginning to give way under the enormous strain. But the thought of her teammates dying because she couldn't carry them to safety drove her forward with desperate determination. Diesel began to stir on her shoulders, his unconsciousness broken by the jostling movement and the sound of nearby gunfire. "What's happening?" he mumbled weakly, his voice confused and disoriented. "Stay still, Diesel," Sarah commanded firmly, despite her own exhaustion. "I'm carrying you to the chopper. Just hold on a little longer." Diesel tried to lift his head and look around, but the movement caused fresh blood to seep through his bandages. "Doc, you can't carry both of us," he protested weakly. "Put me down. Save Ghost. He's got a better chance than I do." "Nobody's getting left behind," Sarah replied through gritted teeth. "That's not how we do things." The sound of helicopter rotors was getting louder now, and Sarah could see the aircraft circling above the designated landing zone. But the pilot was clearly reluctant to land while enemy fire was still a threat. The SEALs needed to reach the landing zone and secure it before the helicopter could safely extract them. As they crested a small hill, Sarah got her first clear view of the landing zone ahead. It was a relatively flat area surrounded by low rocks that would provide some cover from enemy fire. But between their current position and safety lay 200 yards of completely open ground with no protection whatsoever. "Doc, this is where it gets really dangerous," Bear called out, taking a position behind the last available cover. "That open ground is a killing field. If they spot us crossing, we'll be completely exposed." Sarah looked at the open area and calculated her chances. With the weight she was carrying, it would take her at least 5 minutes to cross that distance. That was an eternity to be exposed to enemy fire with no protection. But there was no other option. "I can make it," she said, her voice more confident than she felt. "Just give me as much covering fire as you can." Before anyone could argue or suggest an alternative plan, Sarah stepped out into the open ground and began her final push toward the landing zone. The weight of both wounded men seemed to double in the bright sunlight, and she could feel her knees beginning to buckle with each step. The enemy fighters spotted her immediately. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions with bullets striking the ground around her and whining overhead. Sarah forced herself to keep moving forward, knowing that stopping would mean death for all three of them. Ghost tightened his grip around her neck and whispered encouragement in her ear. "You've got this, Doc. Don't think about the gunfire, just focus on putting one foot in front of the other. We're almost there." Behind them, Bear and Rocket unleashed devastating covering fire, their rifles chattering continuously as they tried to suppress the enemy positions. The helicopter pilot, seeing the desperate situation unfolding below, began circling lower despite the danger to his aircraft. 50 yards from the landing zone, Sarah's vision began to blur from exhaustion and dehydration. Her legs felt like rubber and she wasn't sure she could take another step. The weight of her teammates was crushing her and every breath was a struggle. But somehow she kept moving forward. Step by agonizing step, she closed the distance to safety. 25 yards, 15 yards, 10 yards. The helicopter was descending now, its rotors whipping up clouds of dust and debris that provided some concealment from enemy fire. With her last reserves of strength completely exhausted, Sarah stumbled the final few steps to the landing zone and gently lowered both wounded men to the ground behind the protective rocks. She collapsed beside them, her entire body shaking from exhaustion and adrenaline. "Incredible!" the helicopter crew chief shouted over the rotor noise as he rushed forward with a stretcher. "I've never seen anything like that in 20 years of combat operations." Medical personnel from the helicopter quickly took over care of Diesel and Ghost, loading them onto stretchers and preparing them for immediate transport to the nearest field hospital. Sarah tried to stand up to help with their care, but her legs completely gave out and she fell back to her knees. Bear and Rocket reached the landing zone and immediately took defensive positions while the loading continued. Enemy fire was still coming from the surrounding hills, but it was less accurate now due to the distance and the covering fire being provided by the helicopter's door gunners. "Doc, you did it," Bear said in amazement as he helped Sarah to her feet and toward the helicopter. "I don't know how you did it, but you saved both their lives. I've never seen anything like it." As the helicopter lifted off and climbed away, from the danger zone, Sarah looked down at her wounded teammates. Both men were unconscious again, but their vital signs were stable, and the aircraft's medical team was providing advanced care that would keep them alive until they reached the hospital. For the first time in hours, Sarah allowed herself to believe that they were all going to make it. The impossible had become possible through sheer determination and the refusal to accept that her size determined her capabilities. She had proven something important that day, not just to her teammates but to herself. 3 weeks after the rescue mission, Sarah sat in the hospital at Bagram Airfield, watching Diesel take his first steps since the surgery. The doctors had removed 3 pieces of shrapnel from his abdomen and repaired damage to his liver, but he was expected to make a full recovery. Ghost was already back on limited duty, his leg wound healing well despite the challenges of the evacuation. "Doc, I owe you my life," Diesel said, as he carefully walked across the hospital room. "When I woke up in that building and realized what you were doing, I couldn't believe it. Nobody that size should be able to carry 2 people like that." Sarah smiled and shook her head. "You don't owe me anything. We're a team. That's what teams do for each other." The story of Sarah's heroic rescue had spread throughout the base and beyond. Military newspapers had picked up the story, and she had been recommended for the Silver Star, one of the highest decorations for valor in combat. But the attention made her uncomfortable. She had simply done her job, the same job she had trained for and committed to when she first put on the uniform. Bear entered the room carrying a stack of official-looking papers and wearing an expression that mixed pride with something approaching awe. "Doc, I've got some news for you. The promotion board has approved your advancement to Petty Officer 2nd Class effective immediately, and there's more." He handed her one of the documents, which bore the official seal of the Department of the Navy. "You're being transferred to the Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado. They want you to help train the next generation of combat medics. Specifically, they want you to develop new techniques for casualty evacuation in extreme circumstances." Sarah read through the transfer orders with growing amazement. The Naval Special Warfare Command was the most elite medical training facility in the military, where only the best and most experienced medics were assigned. For someone her age and rank to receive such an assignment was almost unheard of. "Chief, are you sure this isn't some kind of mistake?" she asked, looking up from the papers. "I'm still pretty junior compared to most of the instructors there." Bear laughed and sat down in the chair beside her bed. "Doc, after what you did out there, nobody's questioning your qualifications anymore. You've proven something that a lot of people thought was impossible. You've shown that heart and determination matter more than size and physical strength." Over the following days, as word of Sarah's actions continued to spread, she began receiving visitors from other units throughout the base. Soldiers, sailors, and Marines stopped by to shake her hand and express their admiration for what she had accomplished. Many of them were people who had initially doubted her capabilities, and their changed attitude spoke to the impact of her heroic actions. One afternoon, a young female soldier named Private Lisa Chen stopped by the hospital room. She was small, like Sarah, probably weighing less than 110 pounds, and she carried herself with the uncertain posture of someone who had faced similar doubts about her physical capabilities. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me bothering you," Chen said nervously. "I'm a medic with the 82nd Airborne, and I wanted to thank you for what you did. I've been dealing with a lot of people telling me I'm too small for this job, and hearing about your mission has given me hope that I can prove them wrong too." Sarah looked at the young soldier and saw herself from several years earlier, full of determination but struggling against other people's expectations and limitations. She gestured for Chen to sit down and share her story. "When I first got to my unit, my sergeant told me I should consider transferring to a support role," Chen continued. "He said that combat medicine requires physical strength that I just don't have. Some of the other medics have been supportive, but others act like I'm a liability waiting to happen." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what Chen was experiencing. I've heard all those same arguments, and I used to worry that maybe they were right. But what I've learned is that being a good medic isn't just about how much weight you can carry. It's about staying calm under pressure, making good medical decisions, and refusing to give up when lives are on the line. She told Chen about her own journey, from the doubts during training to the gradual earning of respect from her teammates. She talked about the importance of proving yourself through consistent performance, rather than trying to argue with skeptics who had already made up their minds. The truth is, there will always be physical challenges that are harder for us than for bigger people, Sarah explained. But there are also advantages to being smaller. We're often faster and more agile. We can fit into tight spaces that others can't. And sometimes people underestimate us in ways that can actually be helpful. Chen listened intently, taking notes on everything Sarah said. When the conversation ended, she stood up with a new sense of confidence and determination. "Ma'am, thank you for showing me that it's possible. I'm going to keep working hard and prove that I belong in this job." After Chen left, Sarah reflected on how much her own perspective had changed since that rescue mission. The doubts and insecurities that had plagued her throughout training and her early deployment had been replaced by a quiet confidence in her abilities. She had proven to herself and others that heroism comes in all sizes. A few days later, Ghost stopped by for his final medical check before returning to full duty. His leg had healed completely, and he was eager to get back to operational status. But before leaving, he had something important to say. "Doc, I need you to know something," he said seriously. "When you were carrying Diesel and me across that field, I was conscious enough to understand what was happening. I knew how much we weighed, and I knew how impossible what you were attempting should have been. But I also knew that if anyone could do it, it would be you." He paused for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I've served with a lot of medics over the years, big guys, small guys, men and women. But I've never served with anyone who had more heart than you do. Size doesn't make someone a hero. Character does, and you've got more character than anyone I've ever met." That evening, as Sarah packed her belongings for the journey back to the United States and her new assignment, she thought about all the people who had doubted her capabilities over the years. Some of those doubts had been well-intentioned concerns for her safety and the safety of others. Some had been based on outdated assumptions about what it takes to be an effective combat medic, but she had proven that determination, skill, and heart could overcome physical limitations in ways that seemed impossible. More importantly, she had inspired other people who faced similar challenges to believe in themselves and pursue their goals despite the doubts of others. The rescue mission had changed her from someone who was constantly trying to prove herself into someone who knew exactly what she was capable of accomplishing. And as she prepared to train the next generation of combat medics, she was determined to pass on that same confidence and determination to others who might face similar challenges. Sarah Martinez had started her military career as the smallest person in her training class, someone who many people believed couldn't handle the physical demands of combat medicine. She was ending this chapter of her career as a decorated hero whose actions had saved lives and changed minds about what it means to be strong enough for the job.